The phone rang at 11:58 p.m. and Emily froze as Daniel's name flashed, then vanished, replaced by unknown caller. She answered, and a whisper said, "Tell Daniel, the lilies are late again." Her throat closed as the line clicked dead. Rain shivered against the window while Daniel slipped his key in the lock, humming like it was any Friday. Emily said, "You forgot your umbrella." Daniel smiled too wide and said, "Traffic was a mess." A wet bouquet dripped on the doormat like a small crime. She smelled lilies and something metallic, sharp as a secret. "Oh," Daniel said, "half for the office, half for you tradition." Emily laughed thin and said, "Since when do offices need midnight lilies?" He looked at the clock and missed a beat. The apartment felt tilted, as if a picture had been straightened wrong. Emily said, "Someone called for you." Daniel's knuckles tightened around the ribbon. He said, "Wrong number." The rain hammered approval. She imagined a second door somewhere else opening to the same bouquet. She said, "Then why do they know about lilies?" Daniel's smile frayed. He said, "Let's not do this tonight." Morning arrived like a lie dressed in sunlight, and Emily set the lilies in a crystal vase. Daniel typed emails with the focus of a surgeon. Emily said, "You were late." Daniel said, "The florist had a mix-up." She watched the ribbon curve like a question mark around the stems. The apartment smelled grand and heavy, as if pretending to be a hotel. Daniel said, "Have go to the office later." Emily said, "They keep calling." He paused for a blink too long. He said, "Vendors confirm delivery on Fridays." She nodded, and felt the nod betray her. He kissed her forehead like a signature on a contract. She said, "What if the address is wrong?" He said, "Then we will fix it." The word we hung in the light, neat and practiced, while suspicion gnawed at its edges. Emily carried a paper bag and walked 2 blocks to meet Maya at the corner cafe. The bell chimed with false cheer. Maya said, "You look pale." Emily said, "He brought lilies again, and a stranger called." Maya's mouth made a silent oath. Emily said, "He claims it is vendors." Maya said, "Vendors do not whisper at midnight." Steam curled from cups like small ghosts. Emily said, "Maybe I am overreacting." Maya said, "Or you are being trained to doubt yourself." The street outside flashed umbrellas and briefcases. Emily said, "What do I even look for?" Maya said, "Receipts, patterns, names that repeat." Emily held the cup and felt heat argue with her cold hands. She said, "If I find something, I cannot unsee it." Maya said, "Not seeing it will not save you." That evening, Emily opened the hall closet and found a second florist card tucked in a shoebox. The handwriting curved with confident loops. Emily said, "Deliveries for Friday, same time." A faint scent of cologne lifted from the paper. Daniel called from the living room, "Have you seen my charger?" Emily said, "Check the desk." Her pulse drummed like shoes on stairs. She slipped the card into her sleeve. Daniel stepped to the doorway and smiled, easy as a mask. He said, "Dinner or takeout?" She said, "I am not hungry." He studied her face and chose silence. The lilies on the table faced the window like an audience waiting for cues. Emily said, "Do your coworkers like lilies?" Daniel said, "They prefer the gesture." Friday returned with a sky the color of old coins, and Daniel tightened his tie with ritual care. Emily said, "I will come with you to the office." Daniel said, "There is a client, drop in." She said, "I do not mind waiting." He said, "Security is strict today." The words landed like velvet bricks. Emily smiled and slipped on boots. She said, "Then I will walk you to the corner." He weighed the protest and let it go. They stepped into the wind, and the bouquet rode his arm like a passenger with secrets. "At the corner," Daniel said, "I will text you when I am free." Emily said, "I will be nearby." He turned left instead of right. She watched the choice hang in the crosswalk. The light changed, and the city urged her to follow. Emily woke to the sound of Daniel whispering into his phone in the kitchen. His words were clipped, sharp, as though each syllable could cut. She pressed her ear to the doorframe and caught fragments. Daniel said, "Yes, Friday, same place." His tone was steady, practiced. Emily's stomach curled like paper in fire. He ended the call with a brisk breath and ran water in the sink. She stepped into the light and said, "Who was that?" He turned with a smile, "Too fast, too neat." Daniel said, "Client call, early reports due." Emily said, "At 6 in the morning." He shrugged and kissed her temple, lips cold. She smelled lilies on his coat, though the flowers were nowhere in sight. She said, "It sounded personal." He said, "Everything feels personal when it wakes you." Her silence throbbed louder than argument. He left for work with his tie tight and shoes polished, and the kitchen clock ticked like a countdown in her ears. Emily found a crumpled receipt wedged in the glove compartment when she borrowed Daniel's car. The date was Friday. The florist's name bloomed in bold print. She whispered, "Half for her, half for someone else." She pressed the paper flat on her knee, her heart pounding like an engine idling too long. Daniel called as she sat frozen, his name bright on the screen. She answered. Daniel said, "Everything okay with the car?" She said, "Drives fine." He said, "Just checking, big meeting today." She stared at the receipt as if it could shout. She said, "You are thorough with details." He chuckled low. Daniel said, "You know me." She said, "I am learning." He spoke warmly, but silence burned behind his words. When the call ended, she folded the receipt and tucked it back, knowing the paper would keep whispering even when hidden. At lunch, Emily sat with Maya in the same corner cafe, her voice lowered to a fragile thread. Emily said, "He hides receipts." Maya's eyes sharpened like blades. Maya said, "That is not sloppy, that is deliberate." Emily twisted the napkin until it tore. Emily said, "He says it is for clients." Maya said, "Do clients whisper about lilies?" The words landed like stones. Emily said, "I need proof, not ghosts." Maya leaned closer, warmth in her gaze. Maya said, "Proof will break you but save you too." Steam fogged the glass, city noises muffled behind it. Emily said, "What if I push too hard and he leaves?" Maya said, "Then you know who he was all along." Emily held her breath and tasted ashes in the silence between them. That evening, Daniel arrived home late, tie loose, bouquet in hand. He dropped his keys and kissed her cheek without meeting her eyes. Emily said, "You bought them again." Daniel said, "They expect it." She said, "Who exactly expects it?" His brow furrowed. Daniel said, "Office tradition." Emily pressed her palms to the table edge. She said, "At midnight, traditions call too." His gaze hardened. Daniel said, "You are twisting nothing into poison." She said, "Then clear it." He slammed the bouquet into the vase, water splashing like small shards. Daniel said, "Stop doubting me." Her voice cracked when she said, "I am doubting reality." He turned away, shoulders rigid, and silence drew a wall between them that felt taller than the ceiling. The next day, Emily crossed the street and saw a woman with Daniel's bouquet in her arms outside a bookstore. The lilies glistened, fresh and heavy. The stranger smiled at the petals, as if at a promise. Emily's chest hollowed. She stepped closer and asked, "Where did you get those?" The woman said, "Delivered to the store, every Friday." Her tone was casual, unknowing. Emily forced a smile. She said, "They are beautiful." The woman said, "He always chooses lilies." Emily swallowed air like glass shards and turned away. Her hands shook as she gripped her bag. The city roared around her, but inside she heard only Daniel's voice saying, "Half for the office." Her pulse beat against her teeth. Emily waited for the shower to roar before opening Daniel's desk drawer. The phone lay under a stack of invoices like a sleeping snake. Emily said, "I will only look once." Her thumb hovered, then moved. Threads of messages showed blank gaps where replies should be. Emily whispered, "You delete the answers, not the questions." A new text flashed. Friday confirmed. Same time. Her pulse climbed the walls. Daniel called from the bathroom. Have you seen my watch? Emily said, on the nightstand. She stared at the screen until it dimmed, then placed it back as if it could bruise. The mirror caught her, smaller than before, edged with doubt that felt like frost on glass. That night, Daniel slept hard, breath thick with wine. Emily lay awake and counted the spaces between his breaths. Daniel murmured, Lena, Lilies, Friday. The name struck like a slammed door. Emily said, who is Lena? He turned onto his back and sighed. Daniel said, client dinner, invoices, flowers, half dreaming, half confessing. She watched the ceiling fan slice the dark into neat pieces. Emily said, you said office. He drifted deeper, unreachable as the far side of a lake. A siren brushed the street and faded. Emily tasted metal and vowed to remember the name when daylight asked for proof. Emily met Maya before work, the sun a weak coin in a cold sky. Emily said, he said Lena in his sleep. Maya's jaw set like a lock. Maya said, names are maps, follow them. Emily slid a napkin across the table, with the word scrawled twice. Emily said, if I confront him now, he will polish the lie. Maya said, then gather more. Steam rose from their cups as if trying to leave first. Emily said, I am scared of the answer. Maya said, be more scared of the question that never ends. A bus hissed outside and people moved like obedient tide. Emily nodded, a small oath forming behind her teeth. That evening, Daniel arrived home with takeout and a practiced smile. Daniel said, let's start over. Emily said, who is Lena? The smile thinned. Daniel said, a supplier, calm down. Emily said, you said her name in your sleep. He laughed, bright and hollow. Daniel said, you hear what you want when you want to fight. She felt the floor tilt. Emily said, show me the emails. He shrugged and opened his laptop with theatrical ease. Daniel said, see, generic orders. Folders bloomed, but everything looked curated, recently cleaned. Emily saw a freshly swept path and knew a storm had passed through before she arrived. Friday noon, Emily stood across from the florist and watched the door like a detective without a badge. A courier stepped out carrying twin bouquets wrapped in red ribbon. Behind him, a woman emerged, the same smile Emily had seen outside the bookstore. Emily stepped forward. Emily said, are you Lena? The woman blinked, surprised, then guarded. Lena said, do I know you? Emily said, you know Daniel. Silence clicked into place like a lock. Lena said, if this is about work, talk to him. Emily said, this is about lilies that arrive at secrets. Lena looked past Emily toward the street, then back. Lena said, you should ask about Fridays he misses on purpose. The courier whistled, and the moment ended, but the name stayed. Friday evening, Emily followed Daniel at a careful distance, the city vibrating with weekend noise. He carried lilies under his arm, head tilted as if rehearsing lines. She ducked behind strangers, her breath shallow. Daniel stopped at a corner, looked both ways, then crossed with deliberate pace. Emily whispered, where are you going? He turned down a side street lined with shuttered shops. She clutched her coat tighter, heels echoing like warnings. Daniel entered a narrow building with no sign, the bouquet pressed close. Emily's pulse beat in her ears. She said, not the office. The door closed, swallowing him. She waited in the rain until courage pulled her forward. Emily reached the narrow door and pressed her ear against the wood. Voices murmured inside, muffled but intimate. She caught Daniel's laugh, different from home, softer, dangerous. A woman said, you are late again. Emily's throat tightened. She gripped the knob but froze. The rain dripped down her wrist and she whispered, half for her. She stepped back into the alley shadows and watched light flicker from upstairs. The window glowed briefly with silhouettes crossing, one of them Daniel. She trembled as the truth stalked closer, no longer hidden. Emily trailed Daniel the next morning to confirm what the night had suggested. He bought 2 bouquets, hands steady, smile to the florist rehearsed. She whispered, 2 lives, 2 deliveries. He carried 1 bouquet toward the office tower, polished marble entrance gleaming. Emily stayed across the street, heart cracked wide open. Daniel greeted the receptionist with effortless charm and left the flowers on a counter, bowing out like a man playing a part. Emily said that half is real, but only half. Her eyes burned as she waited to see where the second bouquet would land. That afternoon, Emily confided in Maya, the words spilling like stones. Emily said, "He has 2 deliveries, 1 to the office, 1 hidden." Maya said, "And the hidden one is Lena." Emily pressed her face into her palms. She said, "I followed him to a building, no sign, only voices." Maya leaned forward, voice fierce. Maya said, "You cannot unlearn this. Do not let him twist it back." Emily lifted her eyes, raw and broken. She said, "Then I need to see it all with my own eyes." Maya reached across the table, steady. Maya said, "Be ready, the wound will cut deeper." Friday evening, Emily followed Daniel again, her heart like broken glass. He carried 1 bouquet into the narrow building. She slipped in behind him, unseen. Upstairs, the voices grew clear. A woman said, "You always bring lilies." Daniel said, "They are her favorite." Emily's world tilted. She peered through the crack of the door and saw Lena, radiant, accepting the flowers with a smile that belonged to history rewritten. Emily's chest burned with fire and ice. She whispered, "The hidden half is you." The curtain tore back, and the secret was no longer rumor but flesh and blood. Emily stood in the narrow stairwell outside the unmarked door and replayed Lena's smile until it hurt. She said, "I need facts, not ache." Downstairs a bell chimed as someone entered. Daniel's laugh rose gentle and rehearsed. Emily pressed her palm to the wall and felt distant music. She texted Maya, "Fingers on the truth now." Maya replied, "Do not flinch when it bites." Footsteps neared. Emily slipped back, heart beating hard enough to shake dust. Daniel opened the door with an empty vase and said, "Same time next week." Lena said, "You are always late and always forgiven." The words bruised as they passed Emily's hiding place. She whispered, "Forgiven by whom?" Her doubt became a blade she could name. She walked into rain and let it cool the heat that tried to carry her away. At dawn, Emily spread papers across the kitchen table like maps of a country she had never seen. She said, "Show me the roads you took." Receipts spelled Fridays with merciless clarity. A florist. A ride share. A cafe near the unmarked building. Daniel entered, shirt crisp, smile measured. Daniel said, "Early start." Emily said, "I am cataloging traditions." He glanced at the paper sea and said, "You are turning errands into crimes." She said, "Patterns into proof." He laughed and poured coffee with a steady hand. Daniel said, "If you need control, say so." Emily said, "I need truth." He looked at his watch and said, "We will be late." The "we" landed like a trick coin and rolled off the edge. Emily met Maya on a bench near the river where gulls argued with the wind. Emily said, "2 bouquets, 2 roots, 1 name." Maya said, "Then the story you loved is a cover." Emily handed over photos of receipts and the building door. Maya said, "You are close enough to cut yourself." Emily said, "I will bleed either way." Maya exhaled and said, "Do you want me there when you call her?" Emily nodded once. A blade turned handle. Emily dialed and waited as water slapped the pilings. Lena answered on the 3rd ring. Emily said, "I need to understand Fridays." A pause opened like ice. Lena said, "Then stop asking me and ask Daniel why he misses birthdays." The river wind stole the last word and left it ringing. That night, Emily set 2 plates on the table and positioned the vase of lilies between them like a witness. Daniel said, "This looks serious." She said, Tell me about birthdays you miss on purpose. His fork paused midair. Daniel said, work swallows days. She said, names swallow lies. Lena said, birthdays. He placed the fork down with care. Daniel said, you called her. Emily said, she exists whether I call or not. He rubbed his temple and said, you are inventing shadows. She said, then turn on the light. Silence gathered under the lamps and grew heavy enough to bend the room. He reached for the lilies and spun the vase a fraction, as if time could be rewound by inches. Friday noon, Emily waited by the bookstore where she had first seen the other bouquet. A small boy stepped out, holding a paper lily he had folded with clumsy pride. He looked up at Lena and said, will he come this time? Lena knelt and said, he will try. Emily felt the ground open and close. She approached slowly, voice careful. Emily said, is his name Daniel? Lena rose and shielded the boy with her body. Lena said, do not do this here. The boy peered around her hip and said, is she from the office? Emily swallowed and said, I am from the other half. Lena's eyes filled and steadied. Lena said, his name is Noah, and he is waiting for Fridays that break. The word waiting cracked the hour wide open. Emily stood in the living room, while the lilies wilted in the vase, their fragrance thick as lies. Daniel walked in and froze at her stance. Emily said, no more offices, no more vendors, tell me who Lena is. His jaw tightened, but he tried to laugh. Daniel said, this again. Emily slammed her hand on the table. She said, no, this ends. He flinched as if struck. Daniel said, she is nothing you think. Emily said, she has a child who calls you father. Silence cracked through the air. His mask slipped, his shoulders sagged, his voice a low growl. Daniel said, you followed me. Emily's voice trembled but held. She said, I counted every lie you fed me with those flowers. The vase toppled, water spilling like truth that could not be contained. Daniel's hands shook as he sat down, head bowed. He said, it was supposed to stay separate. Emily whispered, half of you for me, half for her, but never whole for anyone. He lifted his eyes, wet with fury, not sorrow. Daniel said, you were too perfect, she was too broken, I balanced between you. Emily's throat closed. She said, you built families like parallel streets that never meet. Daniel snapped, and I walked both. Emily's voice cut sharper. She said, and now both end. The clock ticked, marking the collapse of his stage. His fingers gripped the table edge as if clinging to the last fragments of his script. The next morning, Emily sat with Maya, her voice hoarse. Emily said, he confessed balance, as if betrayal were mathematics. Maya's face darkened. Maya said, he split you into fractions, and called it love. Emily held her coffee but did not drink. She said, Lena has a child. Maya's breath caught. Maya said, then he never built you a life, he built walls. Emily whispered, I want to burn them down. Maya placed a hand on hers. Maya said, then choose your fire wisely, or you will burn too. Emily stared at the table's wood grain as if it were a map out of the labyrinth. That evening, Emily waited outside Lena's building, rain-slick streets glowing under street lamps. When Lena appeared with Noah, Emily stepped forward. Emily said, I know everything now. Lena's eyes narrowed but softened at Emily's trembling hands. Lena said, then you know he never chose, he just hid. Noah tugged Lena's sleeve, holding his paper lily. Emily bent down and whispered, you deserve whole Fridays, not half. Lena's face broke into sorrowful acknowledgement. She said, and you deserve the same. For a moment, the two women faced each other as survivors of the same storm. Daniel returned home late, suit damp, eyes hollow. Emily waited in silence, arms folded. He said, so you spoke to her. Emily's tone was steady, sharp. She said, I spoke to the truth you buried. He dropped his briefcase and sank into a chair. Daniel said, I wanted both worlds, and I lost both. Emily stepped closer, voice raw. She said, "You lost me long before tonight." He looked at the empty vase on the table, petals wilted in the sink. Daniel whispered, "What am I now?" Emily said, "A man without halves, because we are whole without you." His silence filled the room, heavier than any scream. Emily packed a small suitcase, while the apartment listened. Daniel stood in the doorway, unshaven, stripped of polish. Daniel said, "We can fix this." Emily said, "We cannot fix what was never whole." He stepped closer, palms open. Daniel said, "I will end it." Emily said, "You ended it each Friday, you just did not watch." He stared at the lily stains on the table and swallowed. Daniel said, "Tell me what to do." Emily said, "Sign the truth and leave the keys." The elevator hummed in the hall like a verdict. She lifted the suitcase, lighter than her relief and heavier than her grief, and waited for silence to make it real. Emily met Maya at the courthouse steps, the stone cold and honest. Maya squeezed her hand once like a seal. Maya said, "You are choosing air over smoke." Emily said, "I am choosing breath." Inside, papers slid across oak, signatures carved new borders. The clerk said, "File complete." Daniel did not come, and his absence felt exact. Emily said, "I thought the end would be louder." Maya said, "Silence is the sound of doors locking behind storms." They stepped into noon, and the sky felt unburdened. Emily breathed until her ribs believed her. In the afternoon, Emily stood outside the bookstore with a paper bag. Lena appeared with Noah, cautious but open. Emily said, "This is for him." The bag held crayons and a small sketchbook with a lily on the cover. Noah smiled shyly. Noah said, "Fridays can draw too." Lena blinked hard and steadied. Lena said, "He told you." Emily said, "He told me by not telling me." They shared a breath that tasted like rain finally moving on. Emily said, "He will not split you to survive." Lena said, "Then we will not split either." The boy lifted the sketchbook like a flag. Evening gathered in the apartment. Emily no longer called home. She collected the last box and paused at the table where the vase once stood. She said, "You were a stage, not a shelter." Daniel entered quietly with a small envelope. Daniel said, "Final paycheck for the life I borrowed." Emily said, "Keep the debt, I am paid in exits." He nodded as if aging all at once. Daniel said, "I am sorry." The words hung like dust that never settles. Emily said, "Be sorry to the people who still wait at doors." She turned the lights off, and darkness finally told the truth. Weeks later, Emily walked by the river, wind clean, phone silent. She carried a single sunflower like a small sun she chose for herself. Maya said, "How does it feel?" Emily said, "Like air with edges I can hold." A child's laugh echoed from the park, and she smiled without flinching. She stopped at the railing and let the flower touch the water. Emily said, "Fridays are mine now." The current took the bloom and turned it slowly, bright and unafraid. The final blow was not a sound, but the absence of one, a life that did not need permission to begin.